Our academic research focuses on the labour market and in particular on workers in the labour market who have precarious jobs or what could also be called bad jobs, or people who are vulnerable or disadvantaged in the labour market in many different ways. And the key issue here is that we're not just looking at workers who have low-income jobs, but also workers who are disadvantaged in other ways, in other employment conditions. So it's a multi-dimensional approach that looks at multiple factors in the labour market, characteristics of employment that make a job less good than others. We span multiple disciplines, from economics to public policy, social sciences, sociology, psychology. All of the literature that I work with and the colleagues that I connect with are from various different academic disciplines, so I'm trying to bring it all together into a single framework. There are two ways of looking at which workers in a labour market are vulnerable. So the traditional way we think about this is to look just at low-income workers. But what our research shows is that workers are often deprived in other dimensions as well. So you have three categories of workers: those who are just income deprived, those who are income deprived and have problems in other areas of their employment, of their job quality, and you have those who are not income deprived, who are earning enough, but who have other employment conditions that make their work very stressful or difficult or dangerous or make them otherwise vulnerable. We're doing our first studies in the United Kingdom. I think recent developments have also shown that the quality of jobs is an increasingly important issue if you think back to the strikes that we've had in the recent past, for example, in the United Kingdom. The proportion of workers who could be described as having poor quality employment fluctuates and has increased. And if you now factor in the gig economy and new forms of work, then you are really introducing different forms of work that are also quite precarious in the long run, in particular because those workers will have accumulated fewer savings, fewer pension rights, and so on, and are contributing less to our social security systems. So at the very least, what we need now is a baseline where we can say, okay, these workers have good jobs, we define it in a particular way, but these workers over here are in a very different situation. They're very vulnerable. They're subject to a number of disadvantages, something we call clustered disadvantages, and those are the people we need to think about. We need to focus on them. Public policy needs to figure out ways of helping these workers so that they can develop their skills, be productive, and develop their capabilities more broadly. And what's really important to remember is working conditions compound each other. So if you have a good job with high income and wonderful working conditions, you really have a very good situation. But if you're a low-income worker and you have an unstable job and otherwise poor working conditions, that serves to generate a compounding effect. And it really means that at the end of the day, you are very vulnerable indeed. One of the key problems with the gig economy is that workers can't predict very easily what their income flow is going to be. If you're earning not very much and in addition can't predict your earnings flow and the stability of those earnings or your hours, that makes life very, very difficult indeed. If you're a high earner and you have fluctuations, that's not so difficult to manage. But if you're a low-income earner who has to pay the rent, who has to pay bills, who has to make childcare work around unpredictable hours, and in particular if you don't know how much you're going to be earning during a particular hour, that makes life extraordinarily difficult. And so what we're trying to measure is this compounding effect that happens in the labour market, where it's not just about earnings, it's also about all these other conditions that make life very difficult for those people in poor quality employment. Based on the existing research from recent years, we have defined three dimensions that we consider to be absolutely key to job quality. So income on the one hand, stability of work on the other, and other working conditions is the third dimension that we look at. And within each of these dimensions, we look at variables that we get from official sources, such as the Labour Force Survey, or such as a household survey in a particular country. In the UK, it's Understanding Society, which is a household panel survey. We look at income levels to begin with. How much is somebody earning per hour? And we establish a cut-off line saying, okay, people above a certain cut-off, for example, the living wage, or it could be the minimum wage, they are considered to be okay in that dimension. And people below that cut-off are considered to be vulnerable or deprived in that dimension. The same with job stability. So what we're looking for are people who have either been in a job for a very long time, so somebody who is self-employed but has an established business and is functioning, or somebody who has a permanent contract or is an employer. People who have temporary contracts, agency contracts, who can't predict how much longer they'll be working for, people who are working in the gig economy, or people who have zero-hour contracts and whose income may therefore also fluctuate quite significantly as a result of employer demand. Those are workers who, in the dimension of employment stability, we would consider to be deprived. And in the overall working conditions, that's the most complicated dimension to measure because we sometimes have better data on this than in others. But for example, if we look at the working week, people who are working an excessive amount of hours, let's say over 48 hours per week, we would consider to be deprived in that dimension. Alternatively, you could be working too little. You could be part-time employed, but actually with a desire to work more hours. So that would also be a criteria in terms of working hours. If you are exposed to physical risks or mental health risks, subjected to continuous high levels of stress, that would also make you deprived in the area of working conditions. Also, if you don't have access to a pension, so if you, for example, are an employee and you have no access to an employer pension, well, the problem with that is that your income in the future will be very low indeed. So we have individual variables that populate our three dimensions, and we define a cut-off line for every single variable that's in the indicator that decides, okay, in that particular aspect of employment, a worker is either okay or deprived. And then overall, we add all of this up and we consider workers to be deprived if they are deprived in at least one dimension of the three that we're looking at. So somebody who is earnings deprived, by definition, is deprived in our measure. But somebody who is earnings deprived and has an unstable job is more deprived in our measure. That's what the measure calculates and works out. Or somebody who is just working insane hours for multiple employers on zero-hour contracts and in the gig economy, for example, but is earning a lot, but they would also be considered to be deprived because that is an unsustainable employment situation that in the long run creates other problems in your life. And we know, for example, from decades of research that poor employment conditions lead to physical health consequences, lead to mental health problems. And so in the long run, we need to ensure that our employment conditions aren't generating other costs. So it's not just about wages, it's also about the other aspects of employment that can be very difficult for workers to manage. The gig economy, for example, has really impacted the labour market, not just in the UK, but all over the world. If we think about how quickly it has developed, this is a change that has happened very quickly over the last few years. In fact, it's a change that has happened so quickly that we haven't even developed the measurement tools yet to really keep track of what's going on. So that's the first big issue with the gig economy, and we will face similar issues as technology improves, as we incorporate AI into our labour market, and changes will be quicker henceforth than they were in the past. The second issue is that gig economy workers tend to work informally, so they are generally classified as self-employed in most economies in the world, which means that they are working for themselves and their relationship with their company, be it Uber, Deliveroo, or a platform like Amazon Turk, that relationship is very tenuous. They are not classified as employees in most countries. You can also have the situation where in a single country, one particular type of platform worker is classified as an employee and the other one isn't. So we have a mix of legislative frameworks here, often based on individual cases of a particular case that went to court, and produced a particular result, as in the case of the Uber drivers in the UK. But we have a mix of circumstances, and they're not all treated equally. And it's not the same whether you're working for a delivery company or whether you're working on a platform at home on your own computer. So those are all very different circumstances, and we haven't really thought enough about how we regulate them, because one of the consequences of having a new type of work like that explode in our labour markets, explode, and is a relative term, of course, because labour markets do change quite slowly. But the consequence of this is that workers who are self-employed contribute less to our social security systems. So as the proportion of self-employment in whatever form increases, our social security systems are receiving fewer or lower contributions. In some countries, especially in the developing world, very widely, most informal workers or most self-employed workers are informal, and they therefore do not contribute at all. So in advanced economies, we're facing a situation where atypical forms of hiring people, so anything that's not a permanent contract, or the increase of self-employment may in the long run undermine the financial stability of our social security systems and of our welfare state. We're gradually, increasingly moving towards a higher proportion of workers in the labour force who are contributing less to our social security systems. And that in the long run has an impact not only on the sustainability of our national insurance systems, but it also has an impact on productivity, and I think this is a very key issue that we also need to focus on. If you have an unstable job, say for example a 0-hour contract, is your employer going to invest in you in the same way as if that employer knew you're going to be around for many years? If you have a temporary job, if you are hired through an agency, who's investing in your skills? Who's developing your skills? The likelihood of that happening is much lower if you have any form of atypical employment relationship than if you have a permanent job. And so in the long run, we are also undermining the productivity of our economy with these employment relationships that don't give people the chance to develop. If you're just surviving, it's very difficult to develop and think about the future. So I think this is also the key issue that our public policy needs to focus on.